Good evening, Jordan.
Hello there, Rod. Good to be with you again.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Jordan.
I was thinking, what is it that we are supposed to be celebrating tomorrow?
Well, in my opinion, it is a celebration of man's freedom and a celebration more than anything else of life itself.
But the word independence.
Oh, sovereignty.
Well, are we independent?
No, we're not.
Well, then what are we celebrating independence?
I don't know why.
Oh.
I don't know why.
Why don't you find out, and then you let me know.
I'll call the Washington Post.
Okay. That great bastion of truth and light and justice. And ask them, why are we celebrating Independence Day where we're not independent? And we're owned and operated by a foreign power, and we're not independent. So what are we celebrating independence for? But whatever.
Maybe I can get through to Kathy Graham.
Yeah. And anyway, so I didn't, we were concerned that maybe I was not going to be on this week. But I'd like to say to those who have been hearing us for the past few months that if you are interested in the things that I talk about and the people that I bring on, be sure to have a pencil and paper, because I'm going to give you a number again, and many of you already know it and heard it. But for those who don't and haven't, I'll be giving you a place to write to and a phone number that you can call 24 hours a day, anytime. And because if something in the future happens where we are not on with this audience and those people who want to order things from me or to talk with me, you need to write down the number, because one never knows what will happen tomorrow. Tonight, I have a young lady who's been a friend of mine for some time, for some years, and she's an exceptionally interesting young lady. I knew that the moment I met her, and we've been friends ever since, and that's been about 5 years ago, and maybe a little bit more than that. And she has a fascinating background and family, and especially in the field that I am most interested in, and that is UFOs, extraterrestrial life, other worlds, that kind of knowledge which has been purposely hidden from us by our masters, who feel that this kind of information is on a need-to-know basis and we don't need to know. And as you've heard me say many times, that I think it's an idea whose time has come that we start interesting ourselves in this kind of knowledge, because if in fact there is something to the stories, the thousands and thousands of stories over the thousands of years, the UFO itself is not a new phenomenon. It did not begin in 1947 as erroneously reported in some documentaries. The sighting of otherworldly phenomena can be traced back to pre-Egyptian. The pharaohs wrote about the things that they saw in the sky. The ancient Romans have many stories about the shiny shields that were in the sky, and of course the Sumerians, one of the most ancient civilizations we have on the earth, talked about those who came down from above, and so there's been all kinds of paintings and drawings made in the Middle Ages by famous artists and painters talking about things that they had witnessed in the sky and painted. So the UFO, whatever the phenomena is, and I am totally convinced that the phenomena itself is legitimate. It's totally legitimate. Now, what the phenomena in fact is, it can be discussed, but I don't think there's any room for discussion as to whether the phenomena exists or not. And if ever I had any question as to the phenomena existing or not, was totally wiped away with my experience that I had up in northern Nevada, where I was a witness to a phenomenal display of 7 of the so-called UFOs, 7 large, white, round, glowing, disc-shaped things. I had no idea what they were. My first inclination when seeing them, I was with 2 other people, and it was about 1 o'clock in the morning, about 20 miles north of Rachel, Nevada, which is like 130 miles north of Las Vegas. We're talking about 150 miles north of Las Vegas, out into the middle of Nevada desert, and I mean it was very, very dark, heavily overcast. And I had 2 people with me, my publisher and a lady friend from Hawaii who was a radio and television narrator over in, and has a radio and TV show in Hawaii. She was with me, and my publisher was with me, and we were driving out and this is about 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning, and we're about 20 miles north of Rachel, and we stopped, and where we happened to stop at 12:30 at night, there happened to be a wide dirt road leading off to the right, and it was a well-kept, wide dirt road. Very seldom do you ever find a well-kept, level, wide dirt road out in the middle of nowhere. And so we got kind of interested to see where it might go, so we took off the highway and began to drive for about, 3 or 4 miles, something like that, until I got the feeling that we had gone far enough. And so I stopped the car. The other two with me didn't want to stop. They wanted to go further, but I just felt we'd gone far enough. And I decided that I didn't feel very safe, and I wanted to get back on the highway. And so by now it's like 1 o'clock in the morning, and so I turned the car around, heading back to the highway because it was extremely overcast. You couldn't see your hand in front of you without the lights on. You could see nothing. It was just totally, totally dark. And so the other two people with me, my friends that were with me, insisted that I stop for a few minutes and at least get out and see if what we might see. And I assured them that it was too overcast and far too late, and we were far too away from the highway, and so it wasn't something I wanted to do. But they insisted, so we stopped for a few minutes. We got out, we turned off the lights in the car, and that is when I discovered what dark really is. Because there were no stars, no moon, no nothing, totally overcast everywhere, no light at all, period. And that is a very dark, it's a very dark world out there. And so we're out in the middle of the desert. Now it's like about 1:30 in the morning, and we're standing there talking to each other, wondering, and I'm wondering why we're even out here. And all of a sudden, the cloud formation over us began to open up just a little bit, but we could see stars behind it. And that in itself was rather startling, since there was no opening anywhere. It was totally overcast. All of a sudden, right where we should be standing, it began to open up a little bit. And we saw the stars, and we all three commented, well, look, there's an opening in the cloud. And just as we were saying that, two large, round, white, disc-shaped things come slowly but surely floating through the opening in the cloud and leveled off underneath the cloud. It came through the cloud, sliced through, and leveled off over our heads, and 5 more round, white, glowing, disc-shaped things followed the 2. Now we have 7, and they're not flying from one. They were coming from north going south, but they were not flying quickly to go somewhere. They were barely floating along, very, very quiet, not a sound. And none of the 3 of us could see any metal superstructure. All we were seeing was a white, very white, round, disc-shaped, glowing, saucer-shaped things. But no sound and no metal superstructure, and it was obviously an awesome experience. You would have to have been there, standing there, and watching and seeing what we were seeing to appreciate the almost spiritual sensation you get by seeing something so otherworldly as that. And we stood there. We guessed that we stood there about 3.5 to 4 minutes total before I finally got spooked enough to decide I wanted to leave, and I'd seen enough. They were still over our heads when I decided to leave, so they were not sailing through from one direction to another. They came through the clouds and then began to stop and back up, and they would change positions and move around and do strange maneuvers right over the top of our heads. And each one of the 7, they looked to be about the size of the moon, each one about the size of the moon. And at the just below the cloud line, so I don't know what that would be, maybe 1,500 feet or so, whatever it is. And for about 3.5 minutes, we watched these 7 beautiful, silent, just incredibly beautiful objects moving around, backing up, moving different ways. This one changing places with that one, and this one backing up, and that one moving around to the other. And then they would stop and lock into place, and then begin to move in unison from the north, moving south very slowly. And so obviously we were just knocked out by what we were seeing. Just totally unglued. We stood there with our mouths open, and finally I said, I've seen enough. I don't know what this is I'm seeing, but I'm out of here. So I had the key, so I'm in the car, and so my 2 companions got in the car, but they rolled the windows down on the passenger side and leaned out backwards so that they could watch the objects as I was driving away. And the objects began to come down closer to us and follow us back to the highway. And they were doing little tricks for the two of them watching. They would do some very interesting maneuverings. They would come together in a circle and then blow out quickly into a 7-pointed star kind of thing. Then they would come together and change places and all that as we were driving back to the highway. Once we got back on the highway, I felt a bit safer because I was mostly concerned. I was not frightened or afraid of the images and the things which we were seeing as much as I was afraid that we might possibly have been on military property and we didn't know it, and then we would really be in trouble. So I felt much better being back on the highway. As it turns out, we were nowhere near military property. We just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But that experience, and we had others while we were out there. This whole area is called, the general area is called Groom Lake, or Area 51, which is right out there by Rachel, Nevada. Many people know where that is. It's a rather famous place. But the experience I had out there with my two friends taught me something. We came away, the three of us coming away from that experience, of course, the rest of that evening, the rest of that night, we could hardly sleep because we were talking about what was it that we saw tonight. And we concluded a couple of things. One is that if that technology, which we witnessed and we all three saw together, if that was in fact human technology, if it were humans who had produced those things, if it was military, but mostly if it was human, then that implies that our technology is so far, far in advance of anything that we had ever thought. And I grew up in a Navy town with Naval Air Station, one of the largest naval air stations in the world. And so I know, and I have family in military, so I know what experimental aircraft and Navy craft and on all those high-tech experimental craft. I'm somewhat familiar with that kind of subject. But what I saw was nothing compared to anything I have ever in my life known about or knew that existed. So we were seeing things that night that was just pretty incredible. And as I said, there were 7 of them. And they were absolutely beautiful with no sound and no metal superstructure as we could tell. Well, from that we deduced, as I said, that if it is human technology that we are seeing, then that alone is frightening because the implications are horrendous. If we as humans have developed technology like this, what else do we have yet in store for us that we don't know that those above us have, that they haven't told us? And second, if that which we saw that night was from another place, being another planet, another solar system, another world as such, if that be the case, then that's even equally as frightening. So either way, we humans are in some serious trouble here, because if that kind of technology is what...
I doubt in the time we have that I would be able to tell them all of them, but...
well, whatever.
I can start off at least by telling them that I have had lifelong experiences with sightings and some contact with ETs or entities or whatever you want to call them. Mostly brought on by the fact that my father was involved in major military operations involving UFO crash site retrievals during the 1950s and early 60s. And I think when you come from a background like that, it has a tendency to tag you, I guess. You know, I suppose I feel somewhat like I'm being followed or watched, or you know, you get to feel a little bit like a lab rat, I guess.
I know what you mean. Talk about a little bit, let them know a little bit about what your father was, who he was, and what he was doing.
Okay. Well, from the earliest age that I can remember, I was born in 1949. My dad, he started out very early on in the military, around just after the turn of the century. He was a lot older than my mother by 25, 30 years, and he started out in the cavalry. And that moved on in as the military evolved into the Army Air Corps and then into the Army from that branch. The whole time after he got into the Army Air Corps, according to my mother, he was in special operations. And according to her, his first experience with any kind of sighting was back in the 1930s off the coast of Greenland. He was on a major military vessel offshore, and there was a whole complement of crew aboard. You know, it was in the morning. They were getting ready for their early shifts, getting their orders and whatnot. And while they were there waiting for their orders for the day, everybody on the ship saw a UFO come up out of the water off the coast of Greenland. And she described the way he described it as being just this kind of an orangish, greenish light that came up relatively close to the ship and then came out of the water at approximately a 45-degree angle and just sped off into space. Now, this is a whole crew, including, you know, high-ranking military officers, and they were all debriefed extensively afterwards. And from that experience, my father developed a much more keen interest and continued to look into different kinds of phenomenon, especially when he was in Europe undercover as a band leader at that time. That's when my mother met him, was right after the war ended. And she and he both had some experiences in Germany at the time. And it would be better probably at some point in the future if maybe you had her on and she could tell you in detail, you know, what those experiences were. But I was quite interested to find out that there were UFO sightings and, you know, activities during World War II and after World War II. I know my mother had a couple of experiences before she met my father when she was on her way to the concentration camp. Now, my mother wasn't Jewish. She was a Hungarian gypsy. But she, like a lot of the other people that were taken into camps, I mean, there were many different kinds of people, not just Jewish people alone, who were subjected to those kinds of horrors and atrocities. On her way, in one of the boxcars, they were sending her to a place called Theresienstadt in Poland, which luckily for me, otherwise I wouldn't be here, was a work camp and not a death camp. This was approximately in 1942, because she was in the camp for 3 years before she was released by the Americans. Or rather, you know, before the Americans came, because she actually escaped right as the Americans were coming. Anyway, she and a bunch of other people were just jam-packed into one of these cattle cars, you know, with the little tiny slits through the wood that you could look out and see what was going on. One day when they came to rest at one of the stops that they were at, my mother said everybody saw some form of unidentified flying object over the train station, and there was just, this was at night, and it was just totally, the entire area was lit up as though it was daylight, and the train wouldn't move, and it was stuck there for a couple of days. It just refused to move after that happened, and eventually, of course, the train moved on, and they all ended up in Theresienstadt. But my mother, you know, comments on various things that the German soldiers were screaming and yelling about when they were outside in a panic, trying to get away and wondering what this thing was. So that was her first experience with a UFO. And when my father found out that she had had experiences, then the two of them kind of started talking more about it, and he eventually decided that when he came back to the United States that he wanted to go predominantly into that area of study and research. And he was eventually requested to do that because of his various experiences and interests. So in terms of that, right after I was born, he started having major forays out into the desert. Predominantly where we lived was in an area that was almost completely either mountainous or desert. The boundaries were from southern Utah to western Colorado, northern Texas, all of New Mexico, the predominant eastern portion of Nevada, from mid-Nevada towards the east, and all of Arizona. So that was his territory. And I remember as a kid, we would get these telephone calls in the middle of the night, and we'd have to pack up everything and take off. I mean, being an Army brat is difficult anyway. An Army family is difficult because you are often just stationed, you know, haphazardly anywhere they might need you. And this was especially true of my father. We always lived in motels. You know, he never had houses, never had pets. I had never had any friends when I was a kid. It was a pretty lonely life for a child. And then again, you're stuck out in the middle of nowhere. And after he told me all of that, he put this little disclaimer on it saying that I could never tell anybody what I knew because it would cause a panic and people wouldn't understand, and they might even consider me crazy for having said something, or that I was just a kid and I was, making things up or having daydreams or whatnot. But he told me after saying that he wanted me to know the truth, and that it was a truth that I could know but nobody else could know at that point in time because it would cause a panic. And I took him very seriously. My dad was your consummate military man. He was so much like John Wayne that John Wayne isn't even as much John Wayne as my dad was. He was very dedicated to the military. His background was such that it was the only home that he knew. My dad was half Cherokee Indian and half Irish. And especially at the turn of the century, being any part Indian was not looked upon with a whole lot of goodwill. People thought they were good guides and such, and especially when he was in the cavalry, that seemed to come in handy with him. But he wasn't a reservation Indian to start with, but people make a lot of judgments about it. And the military was the only place that accepted him for who he was and what he was and gave him a life. And because of that, he became hyper-American, I would say, just totally pro-America, pro-anything that the government said. And it was very interesting living with a person like that. He was very strong in many, many ways. And yet, as his experiences with the UFOs and his involvement in the investigations dragged out into a number of years, he became much more paranoid. Not just about what he was doing, but what could happen to him or to his family from doing it. It was an interesting situation, very interesting situation.
You were telling me once about when you were a little girl.
I'm sorry, what?
You were telling me once a long time ago about when you were a little girl. I think you were saying that you were living on the base at the time, and you had an experience where your mom and dad were visiting away.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Well, that kind of ties in with his starting to feel paranoid. Mm-hmm. This was 10 years after he actually started doing the researching and the investigations. Now, after he told me what he was doing and that these creatures existed, he didn't really ever talk to me again about it. He talked to my mother about it, and it took me years to get my mother to tell me anything, because I was trying to piece things together from memories and all of that. And especially since my dad's demise is such a mystery to us. But as he got more involved towards the 1960s, he started talking to my mother about being worried about me because we were always in the desert. And, he was really paranoid about me being out there all by myself. And he would just scream and carry on if she didn't know where I was. And I don't think he ever really talked to her about the import of what his fears were. But later on, she told me that much of it was because what they were finding in these crash sites were a lot of children. A lot of them were hybrid, but many of them weren't. And I think he started thinking that maybe there was a chance that I could be abducted or something because he wasn't sure why they were there. But regardless, he was also worried about himself. And he used to tell my mother that if he ever went into a military hospital that he might never come out because he knew too much. Now, at first it was very nebulous about what he was saying, but later on it became very, very clear that there were a lot of covert, weird things going on. But in regards to what you were talking about, in 1961, I had just graduated from this wonderful little school in Gardena, California. And that seems like a very unusual place to have something like this happen. I would have thought it would happen more, out in the desert or something, but it happened in a very densely populated area. We were living in this second-story apartment up on the top, and we kind of had the whole floor up there to ourselves. And one day my mom and my dad decided that since I was 11 years old and relatively mature, mostly because I was around adults all the time, I wasn't around kids, I wasn't taken to daydreaming or fantasizing or anything like that. My dad and my mom decided they would leave me alone for the first time in my life. Just for a little while, half hour to an hour, they were going to run over to my aunt's house and then come right back. Well, I assured them I'd be fine, and they left. And I went back into my room after having locked the front door and everything. And I turned off the light in the bedroom. I wasn't afraid of the dark. I enjoyed the dark. And I had a little window behind my bed that had some moonlight shining in, so it wasn't totally dark in there. Anyway, I was just listening to Claire de Lune on the record player. And I think I was probably in there about 5 minutes or so before I was aware that there was this noise in my bedroom. And it was kind of a staticky electricity kind of a noise. But it grew in intensity. And as it became louder, I became more focused on where it was coming from. It was coming from my closet. And it was a relatively good-sized closet, and the door was open. Again, I wasn't taken to nightmares or envisioning monsters or anything like that. I was too mature for a little kid, way more mature than most kids would have been considered at the time. And 7.5 feet tall, maybe even a little taller than that. And this entity, this dark form, was almost as tall as the ceiling was. And I just kept my eyes riveted on this thing, and my heart was pounding right out of my chest. And I watched it, and as I watched it, it hunkered down a bit and spread its arms out to both sides. One arm was so close to the door that was to my right and to its left that I knew right then and there that I would definitely not be able to get out of the room by that route if I tried, at least not then. And then the other arm was spread out but curved in a little bit more. It looked like it was trying to prevent me from going anywhere. And then I became aware of it moving towards me, but it moved in such slow increments. I mean, such tiny increments that I was hardly even aware of the movement. It's just all of a sudden I would realize it was closer. And then it got closer. And I became more and more frightened because I still didn't know what it was. And it was getting closer, and it looked like it was trying to catch me at that point. And that freaked me out. All kinds of scenarios were running through my head at that time in terms of escape or, what it might try to do, who it was, why it was there. When my parents were coming back, I was alone. It didn't seem like I had any options. I felt like a rat, trapped in a corner. It was a very, very frightening situation for me. And as an 11-year-old kid, it's really pressing. You're trying to find a way out of a really what I considered at the time to be a desperate situation. And part of the fear that I felt was just the way it was moving toward me. It was so stealthy. It was like a cat, something wild trying to sneak up ever so gently upon something before pouncing. And that was extremely scary. As it moved closer, it got about halfway to me, and I couldn't tell you how long this took because I wasn't focusing on time at all. It could have been minutes. It could have been much longer than that. But my body was increasingly tense. And all of a sudden, part of it came into the shadow of the light that was coming through that window. And what I saw, I wasn't prepared to see because this thing was reptilian. It had a totally human form in every respect in terms of, the appendages and the configuration on the body and all of that. But I got a very brief glimpse of the side of the face, including one of the eyes and part of the mouth and the hand that was outstretched to the left of me and to its right. It had claws, and that clicking sound had stopped by the time it got to that part of the bed. And it still was going very slow, but as soon as I saw the fact that it was not a human being, I just totally freaked. And right at that instant, I thought I was lunch, and I just wanted to get out of the room, and I pushed with all of my might against the wall with my feet and my hands, and I bounded off the bed and just scraped by its claws on its left hand. It threw open the door, whipped around the corner, got into the bathroom and locked it. And I had all these bedclothes that were tangled around my feet and everything. I was trying to get through them and dragging some of them in with me. Scared to death that this thing was going to get me before I could get away. And as soon as I'd locked the door, not thinking that if it could get into my bedroom, it could get into the bathroom, I thought I was safe in there. I hunkered down between the wall and the toilet. There was just this very small space, but boy, I shoved my little pudgy body in there really fast and just hyperventilated my little life away until I heard kind of a jiggle on the door. And yet it wasn't, this creature, whatever it was not trying to get into the door. And I thought about it just very briefly and then panicked out because it started making these scratching noises on the outside of the door, just going right from the very top of the door frame all the way down very slowly to the bottom of the door. It did it 3 or 4 times. And then I heard the key in the front door and my mother and my father's voice. And they came in, and the scratching stopped, and I heard my dad call my name, and then my mother call my name, and I just was so petrified I couldn't speak, I couldn't move, I could hardly breathe. I didn't know what I had just been through. I couldn't fathom the danger that I was in, and I was worried at that point that my mom and my dad were in danger, but there was nothing I could do. You know, it was like this little survival mechanism kind of turns on in you, and everything else turns off. And I just didn't want to be around whatever this was. And then as my mother and my father, I could hear them walking down the hall calling me, and I wasn't answering, so they became more frantic. And they started screaming at that point, and then my father goes, oh my God, at the top of his lungs and just running down the hallway. And my mother is screaming at the top of her lungs for me. They'd both seen, because from our front door to the bathroom door was a straight line shot of vision. And, gosh, how many feet? Maybe 30 feet, maybe a little less. But if you just come into the door, you wouldn't notice it until you got a little closer, and then you would have seen it. But anyway, they got to the door, and they looked in my room first, and I wasn't there. And by that time, I realized, that I could probably get up and everything. I was safe because it was my dad, John Wayne, after all. And if there was anything there, he'd take care of it, hopefully. And then I opened the door, and I had tears streaming down my face. I was covered in tears and shaking so badly I could hardly speak. And when I opened the door, I saw these deep grooves that had been just carved into the door by this hand with claws, and it had just made curls down to the bottom of the door frame. And it was a very, very, very scary and freaky situation, made even more intense by my father's reaction to it, because he said, that's it, this is over, we're getting out of here, we're moving right now. And we did. We moved immediately after that. And as far as I know, my dad didn't have any more investigation calls. It's like everything stopped right then and there, and we moved down to San Diego.
Well, I hadn't heard the whole of the story. Just
Pardon?
some of it. I said I had not heard the whole of the story. The time we had talked, you just mentioned it in passing, but that is the kind of subject matter I think that we need to look at, because as I have said on this program before, in the Western tradition of theology and religion, there is the accepted concept of angels in religion, in both the Jewish and Christian religion, the concept of angels. And as I've said in the past, angel is nothing more than angel, and El was the name for God, and Ange meant messenger, so it's a messenger of God, and angels. We've talked about how in the Old Testament and New, angels always appeared in forms of men. But there are, and so consequently, I'm saying that in both Jewish and the Christian religion, it makes room for the existence of messengers of God, or the messengers of deity. And where do angels come from? Where do the spirit creatures come from? Well, they come from out there in heaven. Well, where is out there? Depends on where you're standing on the earth as to what you're pointing, where are you pointing out there. Consequently, as I've said in the past, if you are from here, from the earth, you're terrestrial, and if you're from out there, like angels, then you're extraterrestrial.
Mm-hmm.
And with the coming of Zechariah Sitchin's work, where his work is so monumental on the ancient Sumerians, and they're talking, and their ancient writings, and the ancient peoples of the world talking about the gods who came down, and the alien gods who are not of this world, who have come here from another place. And this is all documented from the old Sumerian cuneiform manuscripts and from the ancient Egyptian and from all the other ancient cultures of the world.
Oh, absolutely. Every ancient culture that we have has these God from outer space myths.
Every one.
Every one of them.
Every one.
You just have to read a lot to find all the information, but it is there.
And there's a lot of it, even more so out there than you would suspect. A lot of doctoral theses, a lot of very scholarly work being done. And anytime you get the United States government and world governments involved in the research and the research of these things, these subjects, then you know there must be something to it. If the military is concerned about it and have people doing research on the subject, and they've got special investigators doing this kind of research, then there must be something to it.
Oh, absolutely. And when you have, mythological or mythologically related subjects, I mean, when you're talking about ancient peoples, they had a certain language that they had to deal with in describing what they were seeing. If they didn't have a technological language that was adequate to express technology of the 20th century or beyond, or outer space technology, they would have to relate that to something in their own world. Ergo, you would have things like birds, because something flew, or chariots in the sky to represent something like a UFO.
Right, so therefore, this is not a new phenomena that we are given to understand. The UFO came into the American consciousness in 1947 with a Roswell incident, and that was about the first time that the subject of UFO comes into prominence. In fact, that is not true. In fact, as far back in history as you can go, the existence of extraterrestrial and alien life forms and otherworldly entities and that kind of subject has always been known to all of the ancient, including the American Indians have just tons of material and stories and all of their culture of the American Indians and, as we said, all the other ancients. So there's too much smoke not to be a fire. There's something going on here.
To use indigenous life forms to help you out, especially if you consider these life forms lesser than you in some respect, either physically or intellectually or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So there seems to be some evidence to suggest that if, in fact, these aliens came here to help create our civilizations and kind of gestate them along gradually, that they also genetically engineered a lot of the indigenous life forms. Even in the Bible, there are instances there where they talk about Adam and Eve in the garden and Cain and Abel and all of that. And Cain went out and ended up going with the others. Well, who were the others that were out there?
He said, don't send me out there. He tells God, don't
Pardon?
send me out there because they will get me. And I'm thinking, wait a minute.
Exactly, but
who is they that are going to get you?
He had to have gone somewhere. There had to have been something there for it to even have existed in that form, in that narrative.
Right.
It was not just Adam and Eve and their progeny. There was something else out there as well. And
well, Nancy, in particular, there's that scripture in Genesis where it's always bothered me, but there are many like it. But that one particular scripture in Genesis where Abraham is said to be in his standing on the outside of his tent, and three men come walking up. The scripture says in Genesis, 3 men approached his camp, and he went out to greet them and asked them to please stay and have something to eat with him. And he said that, and they said no, they were too busy. They had something they had to do, but they appreciated it. They thanked him, but they just didn't have time to stop. And then it says, but then he went out of his way and just would not take no for an answer, and they had to stay to have something to eat. And so they said, all right, well, we'll just eat, but we're going to go because we're busy, but we will stay because you insist. And so then it says that he told his wife, Sarah, to fix them the dinner, which she did. And it says, and then after eating, they thanked him appreciated the hospitality, but they really have to go because they're on their way to do something. And they left, and the scripture says, and this was the Almighty God himself, the absolute sovereign God himself, with two companion angels that he had just invited to dinner.
There are a number of places in the Bible where it says that various persons have talked with God in person, walked with God physically, and, you know, it brings up a lot of questions. If you are looking at it in terms of beings from another planet or higher life forms, rather than just as a spiritual thing, it's just another avenue, you know, another pathway to kind of consider, perhaps. At least I find it very intriguing.
Well, I mean, the mere fact that we're told that God said, "Come, let us make man in our image." And then we are told that we are made in the image and likeness of God. And God said, "Come, let us make man in our image and our likeness. Let him become as one of us." You just said, wait a minute, what are you talking about, made in the image and likeness of God? And Abraham sat down with a couple, 3 men that came into camp, fed them dinner, they thanked him. And
don't fit in anywhere. They're still required to do the same kind of work, but philosophically, they know they're different. They don't want to be like their parents. They don't want to be slaves. They want what the white man has. They want the same equal rights, you know?
Oh, yeah.
And so eventually, as more and more of these new generations come into being, there's new problems that have to be dealt with. And eventually, the slave trade has to stop, and the plantations and the cotton fields are gone, because the old way of thinking about the person as being an animal has now been supplanted by the demigod sort of, you know, if you want to look at it like that. The half-breed that is no longer illiterate, no longer willing to be a slave. And I think that's very similar to what must have happened if, in fact, we had entities from outer space come down here and feed the Earth with their own genetics, that there could be a number of us that are, you know, part of that genetic pool.
And that would, you know, answer a lot of questions. A lot of things would be answered with that scenario.
Especially since, you know, still in our own lifetime, we see that there are many people who do not accept blacks, even though they're not at all the same people that came over here. They are more us than anyone else now. And, you know, so it leaves a lot of room for philosophical speculation as to what could have happened. We have done it ourselves. We cannot sit here and say it could not have been done by another.
We've already done it ourselves to another culture.
That's right.
Let's take it from the other side, and let's suppose that maybe another culture came here that was superior, that was our superior on Earth, our humans.
Right. And just as we had a civil war to emancipate the new breed of black man, and they have now assimilated into our society, so could all these demigods, these half-breed, alien, indigenous life form, you know,
that's exactly right.
Conglomerations could have done the same thing.
And if there was some sort of a cross-breeding going on a long time ago with the indigenous or those creatures that were just here on Earth, and nobody knows, you know, that's a whole another story as to how those indigenous Cro-Magnon or Peking man or whatever those hominids were hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Well, just anthropologically, the leap that we took in chronologically a very short period of time for the evolution of man from an ape to Cro-Magnon man, something incredible had to have happened genetically to have made that possible.
Absolutely. The human creature on the Earth today as we know it, our human beings today, when you go back into archaeological and paleontology history, ancient history, you will see that there's for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, these hominids are all looking basically alike. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, pops up us.
That's right.
And we've got a far superior mind as humans today, far superior, we're far superior in so many ways, and yet inferior in that our bodies are, they were all friends, so they would take off on vacations together. And this particular year, and this is about 4 or 5 years ago on the radio, and so the guy called me after I was off the air, and he called to tell me this experience, where these 5 or 6 families had been going out, not mountain climbing, but backpacking in Colorado on their vacation together. And he said they were up on a mountain one morning. They come up over a mountain one morning and looked down in the valley. And we're talking about 5 or 6 Christian families here, men and women and children. And he says, and we all saw that there was a ritual, some sort of a ritual going on in the valley that we had come up on that we were not expecting. And there was a large round area out in the valley. We were up on the mountaintop looking down. And this large round area in the valley had been cleared away, and there was a round circle of people wearing robes, and they were swaying back and forth, holding hands and chanting. And there was obviously a priest or someone in the middle with a robe. And he said, we were pretty far away, but we weren't that far. We could see what was going on. And so he said, we told the children to be quiet, and no one said anything because we realized we were interrupting some sort of a religious ritual or whatever. And he said, while we were standing there, in the circle appeared another entity out of nowhere, and it was much, much larger in size than everyone else that was there. And he said, the moment it appeared in that circle from out of nowhere, it pointed up at us, and the ritual stopped, the singing stopped, everyone pointed up, and we knew that we'd been seen. And he said, so we figured we were far enough away up on the mountain, and they were out in the valley, that, you know, they would never catch up with us. He said, we turned to run, and that entity that was in the circle was there within a few seconds. It confronted us. It came all the way across the valley and up the side of the mountain. It was not human. And he says, there were 6 families here. We're talking about 6 Christian families with women and children. And he said, we all stood there and watched this thing and saw this thing. He said it was well over 7 foot tall. It was extremely muscular, almost an obscenity. It was extremely muscular in body form. He said, but it was designed like a male human. But it was totally filled with scales, and the head, this thing's over 7 foot tall, the head was a head of a reptile. And he said, it stared at us, and we could tell this thing was an extremely intelligent. It was not a reptile in the normal sense. And he said, this thing stood there staring at all of us. And he said, I was amazed. Even the children didn't cry. No one could do anything. They were so frightened. He said, then it finally decided that we were not a threat to it, so it turned like it was going to leave, and then it stopped and turned back around and looked at the men, and it never said a thing. He said, but we could tell what it was thinking, that it was very unhappy that we had interrupted.
Thinking about it, and I thought, if that thing had really wanted me, it could have had me at any time. If it could get into my bathroom and my bedroom, you know, there would have been no problem. If it really had wanted me, what we ended up theorizing was that it was trying to scare my father away from something that he was working on, and that was the way they came up with doing it.
Well, that makes sense to me, that it was merely trying to frighten him away.
Right. And it did. It stopped every single thing that he was doing from that point on.
And then you said that your father's demise was strange.
Very.
Can you talk about that for just a few moments?
Sure. In 1964, my dad started having an ulcer problem that was somehow related to a bullet wound that everybody said was impossible for him to have had because he was never in combat. And anyway, he ended up going into Balboa Navy Hospital after having a hemorrhage. And they did an operation, took a portion of his stomach out, and he was recovering for a while with no problems. And at the time, he was very, very upset. He was extremely agitated. I had told you earlier that he had been telling my mother that if he ever went into any military installation for any reason where he was helpless, that he would not come out alive. Or the other scenario that he gave her was that they would re-induct him because of what he knew, and that she would never see him again. And I heard them talk a number of times. You know, I was young. I was 14. I wasn't totally conscious of the impact and the import of what they were talking about the few times that I heard them. But I was always very, very aware of my father's fear. And when he went into this hospital, it became even more evident because he started talking about it more. He didn't want my mother to leave his side. She had to know everything that they were doing, every procedure, what was going to happen, not to let them give him any medications that she didn't approve, on and on and on and on ad infinitum. And an interesting occurrence that I wasn't totally aware of at the time either until after I talked years later about it to my mother was that a lot of the other high-ranking officers that were in the same ward that he was in started dying one by one. And they were all in the hospital for relatively minor complaints. And I think there were 4, maybe 5, including my dad. And my mother had been talking to all of these women, the wives of these different men. And within a 2-week period, this whole ward was gone.
Did they quickly sicken and die?
Pardon?
Did they quickly sicken? You know, they had a in for, you know, as your father was recovering, then all of a sudden take a severe relapse and...
Very, very much so. It's like he
sounds
was...
like cyclotronic or microwave weapons were used.
He was so good one night on a Friday.
Just like
We
falling
went
off a cliff.
home. It was the first time that we'd gone home in 2 weeks. And that was the 25th, I believe, of July 1964. And we came back the next morning, and my father was in the intensive care ward.
Yeah.
And yet when I talked to him that morning, he seemed perfectly fine. But he was very over his face, and he was always standing in shadows. But I saw him the first time about a week after it happened, and I pointed him out to my mother. And as soon as she swore it was my father, and she tried to run across the street to go to him, and the guy would take off. But he kept showing up again. And, you know, just at different places, this man would be following us around, and then one day he wasn't there anymore.
Well, it's quite a world we live in. And actually, we have just begun to scrape the surface of this subject. That because I know that Nancy and I have talked over the years, and we have so many more stories and things which we need to talk to the audience about. But we really don't have a whole lot of time left.
Yeah, Nancy should get some missing time hypnotherapy. There's a lot more there than what she remembers.
Probably so. Would be
Well,
the-
I didn't have any missing time. That was my mom.
Yeah, but
what
maybe-
you're experiencing there, that the shadow of your father after the funeral, that is common link with a lot of UFO contactees, sort of things.
Is it?
You don't have to remember the missing time to be involved in it.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's very.
Hopefully you go there and they don't find a thing for you if you find a good, competent, non-biased therapist. But I think you'll find that it might ease some of your pain, give you
Yeah,
more information, which is what you're looking for.
Very well could be. Very well could be.
You're sick. I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your call.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank
Yep.
you very much for the call. We only have about 10 minutes to go, and I'd like to say to the audience that we're going to be having Nancy back on for sure. But we only have a few minutes before we're going off, and I'd like to say that if you would like to contact my company or me, let me give you a phone number to give us a call 24 hours a day, anytime you wish. I have talked about on other programs, and I will merely touch on it tonight before we go, that we have 2 books that I feel the people in the audience who are interested in this subject, and especially those who are religious and who are possibly affiliated with a particular church or religious organization, but would like some information on the first 200 years in our development of Christian civilization. In the first 200 years of Christianity, I have a very important book here. It's about, it's almost 600 pages. It's about 560 pages, called The History of the Christian Religion to the Year 200. It was the first 200 years of Christianity. This book has been republished. There's only a handful of them we have, and that's it. And it's $25 plus $4 postage and handling. If you'd like.
Good evening, Jordan.
Hello there, Rod. Good to be with you again.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Jordan.
I was thinking, what is it that we are supposed to be celebrating tomorrow?
Well, in my opinion, it is a celebration of man's freedom and a celebration, more than anything else, of life itself.
But the word independence.
Oh, sovereignty.
Well, are we independent?
No, we're not.
Well, then what are we celebrating independence?
I don't know why.
Oh.
I don't know why.
Why
We
don't
should.
you find out, and then you let me know. And then I'll let you know.
I'll call the Washington Post.
Okay. That great bastion of truth and light and justice. And ask them, why are we celebrating Independence Day where we're not independent? And we're owned and operated by a foreign power, and we're not independent, so what are we celebrating independence for? But whatever.
Maybe I can get through to Kathy Graham.
Yeah. And anyway, so I didn't, we were concerned that maybe I was not going to be on this week. But I'd like to say to those who have been hearing us for the past few months that if you are interested in the things that I talk about and the people that I bring on, be sure to have a pencil and paper, because I'm going to give you a number again, and many of you already know it and heard it, but for those who don't and haven't, I'll be giving you a place to write to and a phone number that you can call 24 hours a day, anytime. And because if something in the future happens where we are not on with this audience and those people who want to order things from me or to talk with me, you need to write down the number, because one never knows what will happen tomorrow. Tonight, I have a young lady who's been a friend of mine for some time, for some years, and she's an exceptionally interesting young lady. I knew that the moment I met her, and we've been friends ever since, and that's been about 5 years ago, and maybe a little bit more than that. And she has a fascinating background and family, and especially in the field that I am most interested in, and that is UFOs, extraterrestrial life, other worlds, that kind of knowledge which has been purposely hidden from us by our masters, who feel that this kind of information is on a need-to-know basis and we don't need to know. And as you've heard me say many times, that I think it's an idea whose time has come that we start interesting ourselves in this kind of knowledge, because if in fact there is something to the stories, the thousands and thousands of stories over the thousands of years, the UFO itself is not a new phenomenon. It did not begin in 1947 as erroneously reported in some documentaries. The sighting of otherworldly phenomena can be traced back to pre-Egyptian. The pharaohs wrote about the things that they saw in the sky. The ancient Romans have many stories about the shiny shields that were in the sky, and of course the Sumerians, one of the most ancient civilizations we have on the earth, talked about those who came down from above, and so there's been all kinds of paintings and drawings made in the Middle Ages by famous artists and painters talking about things that they had witnessed in the sky and painted. So the UFO, whatever the phenomena is, and I am totally convinced that the phenomena itself is legitimate. It's totally legitimate. Now, what the phenomena in fact is, it can be discussed, but I don't think there's any room for discussion as to whether the phenomena exists or not. And if ever I had any question as to the phenomena existing or not, was totally wiped away with my experience that I had up in northern Nevada, where I was a witness to a phenomenal display of 7 of the so-called UFOs, 7 large, white, round, glowing, disc-shaped things. I had no idea what they were. My first inclination when seeing them, I was with 2 other people, and it was about 1 o'clock in the morning, about 20 miles north of Rachel, Nevada, which is like 130 miles north of Las Vegas. We're talking about 150 miles north of Las Vegas, out into the middle of Nevada desert, and I mean it was very, very dark, heavily overcast. And I had 2 people with me, my publisher and a lady friend from Hawaii who was a radio and television narrator over in, and has a radio and TV show in Hawaii. She was with me, and my publisher was with me, and we were driving out, and this was about 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning, and we were about 20 miles north of Rachel, and we stopped, and where we happened to stop at 12:30 at night, there happened to be a wide dirt road leading off to the right, and it was a well-kept, wide dirt road. Very seldom do you ever find a well-kept, level, wide dirt